The 2nd of September, 1945, 4 minutes past 9 in the morning. General Yoshijiro Umezu bent over a green cloth table on the deck of an American battleship and wrote his name. He did not bow. He did not raise his eyes. He stood upright, turned, and held himself at rigid attention while the man who had annihilated his army signed below him. MacArthur did not flinch. He made no demand. He had already won before a single pen ever touched the page. Here is the part almost nobody speaks about. The Japanese officers who climbed the gangway of the USS Missouri that morning were not shattered men. They were not shaking. They were not pleading. General Umezu had stood before the Emperor of Japan only 3 weeks earlier and argued loudly, even furiously, that the nation should fight to the last civilian on the home islands rather than capitulate. He had lost that argument, but he had not surrendered who he believed himself to be. And as he set foot on that deck, he meant to make one thing unmistakable. You may have beaten us, but you have not broken us. This created a problem, a grave one, a problem capable of unraveling everything. Because if Umezu and the rest of the delegation could stage this moment on their own terms, if they could stand there with their ceremonial swords and their iron composure and their samurai bearing, communicating through posture alone, that this was merely one military conducting a transaction with another, then the ceremony would mean nothing at all. Worse than nothing. It would mean something dangerous. The German army had done precisely this after 1918. They had walked away from defeat and spent 20 years persuading an entire generation that they had never truly lost, that they had been stabbed in the back, that the army itself remained undefeated. That myth produced Adolf Hitler. MacArthur had no intention of permitting a repeat, not here, not aboard his ship, not on his morning. What he did instead stands as one of the most exact pieces of psychological engineering in the history of military command. And it began with no speech, no threat, no display of force. It began with a table, rewind 6 weeks. Japan's announcement of surrender came on the 15th of August, 1945, carried over the radio in the Emperor's own voice, a voice the vast majority of Japanese citizens had never once heard. It was the first time Hirohito had ever addressed his people directly. The country fell silent. Some wept, some could not grasp what they were hearing, and in military headquarters scattered across the Pacific, men who had fought this war for 4 years felt something they could scarcely put into words. It was finished. But MacArthur understood, with the cold certainty of a man who had studied Japan for decades, that nothing was truly finished until it was made permanent, until it was witnessed, until it was carved into the physical record of history in a form that could never be softened, reinterpreted, mythologized, or undone. The formal surrender ceremony had to achieve what artillery and atomic fire could not. It had to reach into the belief system of 60 million people and reorder it. It had to take an empire built around the divine invincibility of its own army and make the defeat real, not merely real on paper but real to the eye, real in structure, real in history. MacArthur had roughly 18 days to design it. He started with the ship. The USS Missouri was selected precisely because she was the most powerful battleship the United States possessed. Named for the home state of President Harry Truman, she rode at anchor in Tokyo Bay in Japanese waters in the very harbor of the enemy capital, and her presence there said everything without a syllable. You could not invent a more total symbol of what had happened across the Pacific. This was not neutral ground. This was conquered ground. He chose the position of the table with the same care. The surrender table stood at the center of the deck, draped in green cloth. It was not a table for negotiation. It was not set between two equals. The Japanese delegation would stand on one side. The Allied representatives would stand on the other. There was exactly one way to read that arrangement, and MacArthur made certain no second reading existed. Then came the witnesses. This is where MacArthur's grasp of the moment turned extraordinary. He did not simply summon senior Allied officers. He placed 2 specific men directly within his own line of sight, positioned where the Japanese delegation could not avoid them the instant they lifted their eyes from the documents. General Jonathan Wainwright, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. You have to understand who these men were. Wainwright had commanded American forces in the Philippines when Japan invaded in 1941. He had fought as long as flesh allowed. He had run out of food, of medicine, of ammunition, of men. In May of 1942, in one of the most anguished decisions in American military history, he surrendered Corregidor. He had spent the 3 years and 4 months since inside Japanese prisoner of war camps. In those camps, he had lost 60 pounds. He had been starved, degraded, driven to manual labor under conditions that killed thousands of his soldiers. He was 59 years old and looked far older. Percival had commanded the British garrison at Singapore. In February of 1942, he surrendered to General Yamashita with 85,000 troops. the largest capitulation of British-led forces ever recorded. The Japanese military had paraded it as proof of Western frailty. The photograph of Percival advancing toward Japanese lines beneath a white flag had been printed onto propaganda posters across Asia. MacArthur had requested both men specifically. He had arranged for them to stand directly behind him as the Japanese signed. When Umezu and Shigemitsu looked up from the surrender documents, they would see the living proof of what this ceremony was undoing. They could not pretend otherwise. There was no visual exit. The message was built into the room itself. Now, the morning of the 2nd of September, the Japanese delegation arrived at 56 minutes past 8. 11 men in 2 groups, the military officers first, the civilian diplomats behind them. The sky over Tokyo Bay was flat and gray. No dramatic sunlight, no cinematic clarity. Only the low overcast of a Pacific morning and several hundred American officers and enlisted men lining every deck above in complete silence. The silence was intentional. MacArthur had arranged no cheering. He had arranged no jeering. He had arranged silence. The particular patient silence of men who have already won and are merely waiting for the paperwork. That silence said what no shout could. We do not need to perform. We have nothing left to prove. You are standing here because we decided you would stand here, and the only remaining question is how long it takes you to sign. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu came up the gangway leaning on a cane. In 1932, a Korean independence activist had thrown a bomb at a Japanese military ceremony in Shanghai, and Shigemitsu had lost his leg in the blast. He climbed slowly, visibly straining. Every American officer on that deck watched him ascend. Umezu followed in dress uniform, rows of medals, ceremonial sword at his hip. His face held exactly what Japanese military culture demanded in that instant. A mask, absolute stillness. The body carried so rigidly that the rigidity itself became a statement. He was not present as a man accepting defeat. He was present as a soldier carrying out an imperial order. There was a difference. He intended that difference to be seen. MacArthur let them reach the table. He let them stand. He waited until the delegation was fully in place, and only then did he arrive. He did not hurry. He walked with his familiar long stride, came to the microphone, looked at the delegation, then out across the assembled officers, and spoke in a voice flat and deliberate, the voice of a man who has already decided how this ends. He said the parties would now execute the formal surrender. Shigemitsu lowered himself into the chair at the table. He adjusted his cane. He looked at the documents and appeared to study them. For what witnesses later described as an excruciating stretch of time, he sat there, pen in hand, reading or seeming to read. The hesitation was plain to everyone on the deck. MacArthur said nothing. He watched 30 seconds. 45, a full minute passed. Then, in a tone that several accounts describe as sharply quiet, MacArthur instructed General Richard Sutherland to show Shigemitsu where to sign. The hesitation ended. Shigemitsu signed. Umezu came next. He did not sit. He bent forward over the table on his feet and wrote his name. He did not look at MacArthur. He did not acknowledge the Allied representatives across from him. He signed, straightened, and returned to his place. His face never changed. And here is what MacArthur had understood that no one else had fully put into words. It did not matter. None of it mattered. Not the composure, not the mask, not the ceremonial sword, not the refusal to bow, not the bearing of men performing military dignity under maximum strain. None of it touched what was actually taking place, because MacArthur had not constructed a ceremony that required the Japanese to act out submission. He had constructed a ceremony in which submission was structurally completed by the simple fact of being there, by arriving, by standing on that side of the table, by setting a signature on a document declaring, in language that would survive for the whole of recorded history, that Japan had surrendered. The war in the Pacific ended here. This is where it happened. These are the names of the men who signed it. You could stand straight. You could keep your face correct. You could withhold every visible gesture of humiliation. The architecture of the ceremony had already finished the sentence without your consent. The signing took 23 minutes. When the last Allied representative set down his pen, MacArthur returned to the microphone. He called for peace. He said he hoped a better world would emerge. He held out a future in which Japan and its people still had a place, not out of sentiment but out of strategy, because a defeated people with no future are exactly the conditions that breed the next war. Then, as if cued by God or by MacArthur, who in the Pacific theater were often interchangeable, the sound arrived first, a low building thunder from the overcast sky. The planes appeared, hundreds of them, B-29s and carrier aircraft in tight formation crossing Tokyo Bay in a display timed to the second. The roar swept across the harbor. It faded. The silence returned. Umezu had not bowed, but he had signed his name beneath an instrument of surrender before hundreds of witnesses, Aboard an American ship in Japanese waters, with the men his armies had imprisoned, standing directly behind the general who had defeated him across 9,000 miles of ocean, the bow was never the point. The bow was the smallest part of what occurred that morning. MacArthur had grasped something the Japanese military, for all its discipline and all its centuries of warrior tradition, had not. You do not need a man to kneel if you have already built the room that makes him small. The ceremony closed. MacArthur folded his prepared remarks and stepped back. He held 17 minutes of film, hundreds of photographs, 2 signed original documents, and the testimony of hundreds of witnesses. But here is what no one watching that morning yet understood. What happened in Tokyo Bay was only the foundation. The real battle, the one that would decide whether the surrender held, whether it became permanent, whether Japan would rise again as an ally or smolder toward a second war, had not yet begun. And it would demand that MacArthur do something that stunned his own staff, alarmed Washington, and offended every instinct of a victorious commander. He was going to walk into the Imperial Palace and make a decision that would either save Japan or destroy everything the surrender had built. Here is a figure almost no one knows. In September of 1945, MacArthur had roughly 400,000 American troops to govern a nation of 80 million people spread across 4 main islands, a wrecked economy, and a military culture that had spent 80 years teaching its citizens that surrender was a kind of death. That ratio, 1 soldier for every 200 civilians, was not an occupation force, it was a skeleton. And MacArthur knew that if the wrong choice was made in the first 72 hours, the skeleton would not hold. The pressure was coming from Washington, and it was coming hard. Secretary of State James Burnens had cabled headquarters within hours of the Missouri ceremony with a recommendation backed by several senior figures in the Truman administration. Arrest Emperor Hirohito. Charge him before the Allied tribunal. Try him beside the generals who had planned and waged the war. The logic was simple. You could not hold Nazi leaders to account at Nuremberg while leaving the head of the Japanese state untouched in his palace. The optics were impossible. The principle was indefensible. Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, MacArthur's military secretary and one of his closest advisors on Japan, walked into the office in Yokohama on the evening of the 2nd of September with the cable in hand. Fellers had spent years studying Japanese culture and psychology. He had written the assessments that shaped American propaganda across the Pacific. He understood what the emperor meant to ordinary Japanese people in a way most American officers did not. MacArthur read the cable. He set it down. He looked at Fellers and said something Fellers later recorded. If we arrest Hirohito, I will need 1 million men to hold this country together. Do we have 1 million men? Fellers said they did not. MacArthur said, then we are not arresting Hirohito. It was not a complicated calculation, but it was an enormously dangerous one. MacArthur was about to directly contradict the Secretary of State, override the instinct of the administration, and make a unilateral decision about the most politically charged figure in occupied Japan on the strength of his own judgment and nothing else. If he was wrong, there was no recovery. He cabled Washington the next morning. Arresting the emperor would create a martyr. It would not serve justice. It would guarantee instability. The occupation needed a stable administrative structure, and the emperor was the only figure in Japan able to provide one. He recommended against the arrest and announced his intention to meet Hirohito privately before any further step was taken. Washington was not pleased, but MacArthur was the supreme commander, and he was already moving. The meeting was set for the 27th of September, 1945, at the American Embassy in Tokyo, 25 days after the Missouri. In the weeks between, MacArthur had moved his headquarters into the Daiichi Insurance Building, a 6-story Western structure that stood directly across the moat from the Imperial Palace grounds. Every citizen passing the palace could see the Supreme Commander's building on the far side of the water. MacArthur had not chosen that spot by chance. The geography of authority was written into the daily landscape of the city. On the morning of the 27th, Hirohito dressed in formal morning clothes, black coat, striped trousers, top hat, and rode to the embassy in a motorcade. He was the son of heaven, descended by imperial tradition from the goddess Amaterasu. He had never once in his life traveled to meet another man. Other men traveled to meet him. The journey itself, before he ever stepped inside, said what no battleship deck had said quite so directly. MacArthur received him in his open-collar khaki uniform, no jacket, no medals, exactly what he wore every day. He did not dress up for emperors. The meeting lasted 37 minutes. By MacArthur's own instruction, no transcript was made. What we know comes from the interpreters present. Hirohito spoke first. He said he had come to offer himself to the judgment of the Allied powers. He said responsibility for the war rested with him. and whatever MacArthur and the tribunal decided regarding his person, he accepted it. By every account, MacArthur was visibly moved. He had expected a man performing submission. Instead, he received what seemed to be genuine acceptance of consequence. Whether it was sincere or strategic, MacArthur could not know. What he knew was that this response, offered in private, with no audience and no political advantage to gain, was either the most honest statement a Japanese leader had made since the war began or the most sophisticated move available to a man with no options left. MacArthur extended his hand. Afterward, a photographer was brought in. The image was taken in the entrance hall, MacArthur in his khakis, standing nearly a head taller than the emperor in his formal dress. The contrast was total, not staged to humiliate but staged to record. That photograph ran in every Japanese newspaper the following morning and on front pages across the Allied world. In a single image, with no caption needed, it announced the new structure of authority. The emperor remained, but the source of his legitimacy had changed. MacArthur converted that reality into policy at once. Through directives issued in the first weeks of October, he dissolved the apparatus of imperial military authority, beginning with the formal abolition of the armed forces themselves. The Japanese Imperial Army and Navy ceased to exist as legal institutions on the 15th of October 1945, 6 weeks after the Missouri. The men who had built their whole identity around those institutions, who had believed in complete sincerity that service to the emperor through military discipline was the highest purpose a human being could hold, were now civilians. Then MacArthur did something that startled even his own staff. He ordered his team to begin drafting a new Japanese constitution, not to impose American law wholesale, but to design a structure that would make the very conditions that had produced the war, the unchecked military power, the suppression of civilian government, the emperor worship that had functioned as a political weapon, structurally impossible in the future. The document that emerged, adopted in 1947, contained one article with no precedent in any national constitution in history. Article 9. Japan renounced war permanently. The state committed itself in its foundational law never again to maintain offensive military capacity. The nation that had built the largest naval air arm in history, that had planned and carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had occupied territory from Manchuria to the Solomons, now wrote into its constitution that it would never again wage war. But the harder problem was not the soldiers with rifles. It was the war that had quietly continued after the broadcast. In late October, a folder landed on MacArthur's desk inside the Daiichi building. Inside was the name of a plan that had been running since the 16th of August, the day after the emperor told Japan the war was over. The plan was called Ketsugo, continuation of decisive operation. Intelligence estimated that between 200,000 and 350,000 armed Japanese soldiers across the home islands had not surrendered their weapons or their allegiance. They had signed nothing. They had accepted nothing. They were waiting. This was not organized rebellion. It was something more complicated and in some ways more dangerous. These were men who had received the surrender broadcast and experienced it as a kind of cognitive collapse. Their entire identity, every belief about duty and sacrifice, had been organized around the certainty that Japan could not be defeated. The shock was total. The intelligence that most alarmed MacArthur's staff was a network of communication still operating after the surrender, linking hardline factions across multiple prefectures with one shared message. The emperor was coerced. The surrender was not legitimate. The war was not over. MacArthur read it, made its decision that contradicted every conventional instinct of occupation. He did not order a sweep. He calculated correctly that a visible American crackdown would manufacture exactly the martyrdom the hardliners needed. Every soldier killed resisting disarmament would become a symbol. Instead, he issued his order through the emperor's own command structure. Hirohito, whose position rested entirely on MacArthur's decision to permit it, issued imperial directives ordering immediate and complete disarmament, directives carrying the full weight of the authority these men had built their lives around obeying. MacArthur had kept the emperor in place precisely for this. He turned the imperial chain of command into an instrument of occupation without firing a single additional shot. It worked, not instantly, not completely, but unit after unit stood down over the following weeks. The network lost its coherence. As local commanders received imperial orders they could not refuse without repudiating the very framework that had given their lives meaning. By December of 1945, the formal disarmament was by any measure complete. Over 7 million soldiers and sailors were demobilized. More than 3 million additional troops stationed across Asia and the Pacific were repatriated and disarmed. The largest military force Asia had ever produced ceased to function as an institution in roughly 90 days, achieved through paper, chain of command, and a preserved emperor what MacArthur himself estimated would have required 1 million more troops and years of bloodshed to do by force. The Constitution was adopted by the Imperial Diet in November of 1946 and came into force on the 3rd of May 1947. Drafted in 6 days by American lawyers and officers in a building across the moat from the palace, it would govern the country for the next 8 decades without a single amendment. Umezu was in Sugamo prison by December of 1945. He was convicted of war crimes in November of 1948 and died in that prison in January of 1949, 4 years after standing at rigid attention on the Missouri with his sword at his hip and his face arranged into controlled refusal. He had given MacArthur nothing visible to call submission. None of it had made the slightest difference to what came after. There was one figure the occupation files never quite resolved. Not a general, not a cabinet minister, but a man who had been near decisions that shaped the entire trajectory of post-war Japan, and who left almost no record of what he believed about any of it. Declassified records released in the 1990s identified him as a mid-level liaison officer named Takashi Moroka. In the 17 days between the broadcast on the 15th of August and the ceremony on the 2nd of September, he had been carrying messages between the hardline faction trying to keep Ketsugo alive and the imperial household officials working to ensure the surrender proceeded without incident. He was, depending on how you read the evidence, either a double agent undermining the resistance on behalf of the palace, or a genuine hardliner who lost his nerve at the final moment. The files do not resolve it. Moroka was never charged, never publicly identified during the occupation. He lived in Osaka until 1978, worked as an accountant, and left behind a single handwritten account that his family donated to a prefectural archive in 2003. It runs 41 pages and has never been translated into English. In it, he wrote that he did not know whether he was loyal or a traitor. He only knew that more men dying would not change what had already been decided by heaven. MacArthur ran the occupation until April of 1951, nearly 6 years after the surrender, when President Truman relieved him of command during the Korean War for publicly contradicting policy on whether to expand the fighting into China. He returned home to a ticker tape parade and an address to a joint session of Congress that produced one of the most quoted lines in American military history. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Then he largely did exactly that, living quietly in the Waldorf Astoria until his death in April of 1964 at 84. He never returned to Japan. He saw only the beginning of what the country became, the first years of recovery before the economic miracle transformed a bombed, famine-threatened nation into the world's second-largest economy within a single generation. The Japanese people built that through their own labor and ingenuity, but the occupation created the conditions, the land reform, the dissolution of the Zaibatsu combines, the constitution, the security guarantee that let Japan pour its resources into industry instead of armies. The lesson the Missouri carries across 8 decades is not finally about military strategy or constitutional design, extraordinary as both achievements were. It is about the relationship between authority and architecture, the principle that the most complete forms of power are the ones that never need visible force to operate. MacArthur never raised his voice on that deck. He never threatened the delegation. He built a situation in which the physical reality of the defeat was so structurally complete that no behavior available to the Japanese officers could contest it. And then he extended that same principle across 6 years, institution by institution, converting a military surrender into a social transformation without triggering the resistance that open suppression would have produced. Historians estimate that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the home islands, would have killed between 250,000 and 1 million American soldiers and between 5 and 10 million Japanese, based on projections prepared by MacArthur's own staff in the summer of 1945. The occupation that replaced invasion cost a fraction of that in every category. Japan has not fought a war since the 2nd of September, 1945, not a single one. Umezu had refused to bow. He kept his composure, his bearing, his ceremonial sword, every visible marker of dignity available to him on that deck, and he died 4 years later in a prison cell, convicted by a tribunal operating under a constitution drafted across the moat from the palace of the emperor he had served his whole life. MacArthur had not needed the bow. He had already built the room. The most durable victories are never the ones taken by force. They are the ones built so completely into the world around the defeated party that the only thing left to argue about is how they stood while it happened.